Something strange happens after certain relationships end. On the surface, it looks like one person moved on effortlessly, while the other is left carrying the weight of unanswered questions. You replay the memories, the conversations, the quiet moments that once felt meaningful, and yet the person who once shared all of that with you now seems distant, almost as if the connection never existed at all. Their silence feels loud, their absence feels intentional, and the most painful thought begins to creep into your mind. Maybe you were simply forgotten. But what if the story unfolding inside their mind is very different from the one you see on the outside? What if the silence you interpret as indifference is actually a complicated emotional defense, one that hides feelings rather than expressing them? Because with certain personalities, the disappearance is not always a sign that the feelings vanished. Sometimes it is a sign that those feelings became too overwhelming to face directly. To the person who loved deeply, the sudden distance can feel like emotional abandonment. One day, the connection feels real, intimate, even meaningful. The next day, it feels like the door has quietly closed without explanation. No long conversation, no emotional closure, just space and an unsettling sense that you were erased from their emotional world. And that is where the real confusion begins. Because when someone walks away in silence, the mind naturally assumes the worst. You begin asking questions that slowly turn into self-doubt. Did they ever truly care? Was the relationship real for them? Did you misread everything? The brain searches for logic, but the behavior seems illogical. Someone who once shared moments of closeness now behaves like a stranger. Yet hidden beneath this behavior is a psychological pattern that many people misunderstand. There are individuals who experience closeness differently than most. When emotional intimacy grows, something inside them begins to feel threatened instead of comforted. Their instinct is not to move closer, but to move away. And when they step back, they do it in a way that often looks cold, detached, and final. But the strange paradox is this. Distance does not always erase feelings. In fact, for some people, distance is the only place where they finally allow themselves to feel them. And this is where the quiet truth begins to reveal itself. The person who appears emotionally unaffected may actually be carrying a hidden tension inside, a silent thirst for the connection they once experienced but did not know how to handle. They may not express it, they may not show it, but internally, the memory of the connection can remain far longer than anyone expects. This is the paradox that so many people never see. On the outside, you feel forgotten, but inside their mind, something unfinished may still exist. And understanding this psychological dynamic changes the way you see the entire situation. To understand why this pattern happens, you have to look beneath the surface of their behavior. Some people grow up learning that emotional closeness is not always safe. Maybe their feelings were dismissed, ignored, or criticized. Maybe vulnerability led to disappointment. Over time, their mind adapted by creating a simple survival strategy: rely on yourself and limit emotional dependence on others. This strategy becomes deeply embedded in how they approach relationships. At first, everything may feel normal. In fact, these individuals can appear charming, confident, and even attentive in the early stages. When emotional intimacy is still light and playful, they feel comfortable. They enjoy the connection, they enjoy the companionship, and the relationship seems to move forward naturally. But something begins to change when the emotional bond deepens, when conversations become more vulnerable, when expectations grow, when the connection begins to feel emotionally significant. An invisible alarm can quietly activate inside them. It's not a conscious decision. It's a deeply ingrained response, shaped by years of emotional conditioning. Instead of feeling safe in closeness, their mind begins to associate closeness with pressure. They may start noticing small things that suddenly feel overwhelming. The emotional depth of the relationship begins to feel like responsibility. The vulnerability required for intimacy begins to feel like exposure. And before they even fully understand what is happening, their instinct starts pushing them toward distance. This is why their behavior can change so suddenly. The person who once seemed engaged may begin pulling away. Conversations become shorter, messages become less frequent, emotional discussions are avoided. They may become busy, distracted, or emotionally unavailable. To the partner who values connection, This shift feels confusing and painful. It feels like the relationship is slowly slipping away for no clear reason. But inside the avoidant mind, the withdrawal feels like self-protection. They are not always consciously thinking, "I don't care about this person." Instead, their mind is reacting to an internal discomfort they struggle to explain. The more emotionally close the relationship becomes, the stronger their instinct to regain distance. And this creates one of the most heartbreaking misunderstandings in relationships. One person interprets distance as lack of love. The other creates distance because they feel overwhelmed by the intensity of the connection itself. Both people are reacting emotionally, but from completely different internal experiences. And because these feelings are rarely communicated clearly, the relationship often begins to fracture quietly, leaving both sides confused about what really happened. The turning point in these relationships rarely happens in one dramatic moment. Instead, it builds slowly, almost invisibly. At first, everything feels promising. The connection grows deeper. Conversations become more meaningful. Shared experiences create emotional memories that strengthen the bond. But beneath the surface, the avoidant partner may begin feeling something that is difficult for them to describe. The closeness starts to feel heavy, not because the relationship itself is unhealthy, but because emotional intimacy activates fears they have spent years trying to suppress. When someone truly begins to know them, when their inner world becomes visible, the vulnerability can feel unbearable. Instead of feeling understood, they may feel exposed. Instead of feeling safe, they may feel trapped. This is the moment when their behavior subtly changes. They may start needing more space. They might pull back from deep conversations. Small conflicts suddenly feel larger than they actually are. They might begin focusing on flaws in the relationship that previously did not bother them. To the partner who values emotional connection, this shift feels confusing. It feels like the person you were building something meaningful with has suddenly changed direction. You may try to fix the distance by becoming more understanding, more patient, more loving. You might try to reassure them that everything is okay. You might try to bring the closeness back. But the more the relationship pushes toward emotional depth, the more their instinct may pull them away. This is not because they never cared. It is because caring too deeply begins to trigger fears they do not fully understand. And so the cycle begins. The closer you move emotionally, the more they move physically or psychologically away. And without realizing it, the relationship becomes a quiet struggle between connection and escape. When the distance finally becomes obvious, the emotional impact can be devastating for the partner who longs for connection. The messages slow down, the warmth fades, the emotional presence that once felt comforting now feels distant and unfamiliar. And eventually, the silence begins. For the person left behind, that silence becomes one of the most painful experiences imaginable, because silence leaves too much space for the mind to create its own explanations. You start replaying every moment of the relationship. You search for mistakes you might have made. You wonder if you were too emotional, too attached, too vulnerable. The absence of answers turns into self-criticism. The most painful interpretation slowly forms in your mind. Maybe you simply didn't matter. Maybe the relationship meant more to you than it ever meant to them. And that belief begins to sink into your heart like a quiet weight. Feeling forgotten is one of the deepest emotional wounds a person can experience. Humans are wired for connection. When someone who once shared closeness suddenly disappears, it creates a sense of emotional abandonment that is difficult to explain. But the truth is often more complicated than the story your mind creates. Because when avoidant individuals withdraw, they are not always erasing the relationship from their memory. They are creating distance from the emotional intensity they struggled to handle. Their silence is not always proof that the feelings disappeared. Sometimes it is proof that they did not know how to face them. And that distinction changes everything. What many people don't realize is that the emotional timeline inside an avoidant mind is very different from that of someone who embraces vulnerability. While the relationship is happening, they may struggle to fully process the depth of their feelings. When emotions become intense, their mind focuses on creating distance rather than understanding those emotions. So during the relationship itself, their internal world may feel cloudy, confusing, and overwhelming. Instead of reflecting deeply on the connection, they focus on regaining their independence and emotional control. But something interesting happens once the distance is finally created. When the relationship ends and the emotional pressure disappears, the mind begins to relax. The overwhelming intensity that once triggered their withdrawal slowly fades, and for the first time, they may start reflecting on the connection with more clarity. Memories that once felt heavy begin to feel meaningful. Moments they ignored begin to resurface in their thoughts. The presence they once pushed away begins to feel strangely comforting in hindsight. And this is where the hidden emotional shift begins. While the person who valued the relationship has already processed much of their grief, the avoidant mind may just be starting to recognize what the connection truly meant. This realization rarely happens dramatically. It happens quietly. A memory appears during an ordinary moment. A familiar place reminds them of the relationship. A small detail triggers a wave of nostalgia they were not expecting. And slowly, a feeling they once avoided begins to grow inside them. Longing, not always strong enough for them to act immediately, not always clear enough for them to express openly, but present, quietly moving through their thoughts in moments of reflection. This is the hidden stage most people never see. Because while you may feel forgotten, the avoidant mind may finally be starting to feel the emotional thirst for the connection they once ran from. Even when they start feeling the absence, they rarely show it. Their internal recognition of what they lost does not always translate into action. It may remain locked inside, a quiet ache that they carry privately. This is because vulnerability is something they have learned to fear. Expressing longing, admitting attachment, or revealing regret requires them to step into a space they have spent their lives avoiding emotional exposure. The very thought of admitting they miss someone can feel terrifying, even if it is the truth. They may wonder, what if I reach out and the intensity overwhelms me again? What if they see my need and I lose control of myself? So instead of reaching out, they turn inward, they observe quietly, they watch from a distance. Maybe they check social media just to see that you are okay. Maybe they recall the little moments that once connected you, your laughter, your expressions, the intimacy that no one else could replicate. They begin comparing these memories to their current reality, and in doing so, the emotional longing grows. It is subtle at first, barely noticeable, but it accumulates, layering over the silence that once seemed like freedom. This is the phase where they are quietly thirsting for you. It is not a dramatic or urgent thirst, it is almost invisible, a low hum in the background of their thoughts, but it is persistent. You see, avoidants may have spent their lives running from closeness, but when it is gone, the absence creates a void they cannot easily ignore. They begin to realize that the connection they resisted was not a threat, it was something they deeply valued but could not fully accept at the time. And this realization can bring with it a strange mix of emotions. Pride fights regret, relief fights longing, fear fights desire. They may feel vulnerable, even thinking about you, because to acknowledge that they miss you is to confront feelings they spent years suppressing. It's a conflict between their instinct to protect themselves and their undeniable recognition of what was lost. What happens next is often the most misunderstood part of this dynamic. While you are left feeling forgotten, they are experiencing a private emotional tug-of-war. Their mind replays moments of connection, remembering your presence, your warmth, your ability to make them feel safe in ways they cannot describe. But they cannot simply say it out loud. Admitting desire, longing, or emotional dependence feels like stepping into a danger zone. They fear that opening the door will invite overwhelm, rejection, or loss of control. So they act indirectly. They may send small signals, a fleeting message, a like on a post, a casual observation of your life, but they avoid full expression. Even these small gestures are emotionally loaded. Behind them is a deep recognition. They miss you more than they allow themselves to admit. They are testing the waters, gauging the emotional environment, seeing if it is safe to re-engage without risking the vulnerability that initially drove them away. Meanwhile, the intensity of their internal conflict is invisible to you. You feel the absence as abandonment. They feel the absence as emotional thirst, and yet are immobilized by fear and uncertainty. This is why you often find it so confusing when someone who acted so distant suddenly reaches out unexpectedly. It is not impulsive or random. It is the first cautious step of a mind that is reconciling longing with fear. What many fail to see is that this thirst is deeply emotional, not superficial. It is a longing not just for attention or comfort, but for a connection that once grounded them emotionally. They crave what they once had, but their survival instincts make it difficult to express. The internal struggle is silent but powerful, shaping every interaction or lack thereof. It is also important to understand why they rarely admit their longing. In most cases, it is not malice or lack of feeling. Instead, it is a defense mechanism honed over years of emotional experience. Vulnerability has always carried risk for them. In past relationships, exposure often led to disappointment, criticism, or rejection. Over time, the mind adapted by creating a system to suppress and deny emotions when they threaten stability. Even when longing is present, admitting it is akin to opening a door. They are unsure they can walk through safely. Saying "I miss you" is not simple. It is an acknowledgement of dependency, an admission of emotional need, and a recognition that they cannot control the way they feel. For someone whose instinct is to manage emotional exposure, that is terrifying. Instead, they may internalize their feelings, replaying memories in solitude, thinking about you in quiet moments, and feeling a subtle ache that grows over time. They may fantasize about reconnection without ever acting on it. They may imagine scenarios where the connection could be re-established safely, always weighing the risk against their desire. To the person on the outside, it looks like indifference. To them, it feels like survival. And yet, paradoxically, the longing persists. The absence becomes a silent teacher, showing them what they truly value but struggle to accept. This internal recognition often turns into a form of regret. Although it is rarely expressed, they may not use words like "I regret losing you," but their thoughts reflect it in quiet ways. When the emotional dust of separation settles, clarity begins to emerge. They start seeing patterns they ignored while the relationship was ongoing. The unique way you offered support, the understanding you showed, the patience you extended, and the emotional space you created that no one else could match. This regret is subtle but powerful. It is not always immediate. It may not even manifest until weeks or months after distance is established. But once it arises, it is persistent. It lingers in thought, coloring memories, and occasionally intruding in moments when they least expect it. The frustration is internal. They recognize the value of the connection, but simultaneously fear the vulnerability required to re-enter it. It is this tension that keeps them at a distance, even as their mind and heart silently crave the connection they once rejected. They are learning, sometimes painfully, that absence does not erase significance. You remain present in their thoughts, even if you are absent from their life. Their quiet longing is a testament to the emotional imprint you left, one that persists far beyond physical proximity. As this recognition grows, subtle behaviors may emerge. They might begin checking in indirectly, almost unconsciously. Perhaps they notice small details about your life, your social media updates, mutual friends' comments, or the things you share publicly. They might make casual contact, but carefully measured, hesitant, always testing the emotional environment before fully engaging. This is not necessarily manipulation. It is a careful approach designed to protect themselves while exploring the possibility of reconnection. They may long to express what they feel, but do not yet have the courage or emotional readiness to do so openly. Every small action is loaded with internal deliberation. How much can I reveal? How much do I dare risk? What if my vulnerability drives them away? Meanwhile, you are left interpreting the world in stark contrast to their hidden struggle. Their subtle signals may be so minor or infrequent that they barely register, or they may confuse you entirely. What you experience as indifference is, in their mind, an intense, cautious dance of desire and fear. They crave the closeness they avoided, but they are terrified of the very emotional intimacy that once drew them in. This phase highlights the invisible tug-of-war between longing and self-protection. It is not a lack of care, it is a fear of care. The mind recognizes value, and the heart recognizes loss. yet both are constrained by old patterns, creating behavior that looks contradictory from the outside. Fear dominates many of their decisions in this stage. Even when longing becomes undeniable, the thought of reconnecting fully brings a wave of anxiety. They imagine the same intensity of vulnerability they once fled and worry about being overwhelmed or losing control. They may consider reaching out, but the fear of reopening emotional wounds stops them. This is why avoidants often linger in a state of near action, close enough to feel you, distant enough to protect themselves. Even if the desire to reconnect grows stronger, it is tempered by the instinct to maintain emotional autonomy. The longing and fear exist simultaneously, creating an internal tension that can feel almost unbearable, yet invisible to the outside observer. Because they process emotions differently, their timeline for understanding what they feel rarely matches yours. While you might have experienced the loss, processed grief, and sought closure, they may just be arriving at the point of emotional recognition. They are late to the understanding, but not necessarily late to the feeling. This discrepancy is what makes their behavior so difficult to interpret. To you, it may seem like indifference or forgetfulness. In reality, it is an internal struggle, a silent acknowledgement of their loss, and a cautious awakening to the emotional connection they once avoided. Inside this complex emotional landscape, two forces are constantly battling. On one side is the instinct to connect, to feel, to reach out and reclaim what was once meaningful. On the other side is fear, the fear of losing control, the fear of being overwhelmed, the fear of being hurt or engulfed by vulnerability. These forces coexist, often quietly, inside their mind. They create tension that is invisible but palpable in every hesitant gesture, every delayed message, every ambiguous interaction. The push and pull you see from the outside is not whim or cruelty. It is the manifestation of this internal struggle. You might feel invisible, but the truth is that they are acutely aware of you and the absence you represent. They are caught between desire and defense, longing and self-preservation. Even when longing becomes strong, fear does not vanish. The stronger the connection was, the stronger the fear may be, because they remember not only the comfort, but the intensity of the emotions. They remember the vulnerability they once avoided, the dependence they feared, the closeness that felt both safe and threatening. In trying to protect themselves, they maintain distance. In doing so, they paradoxically feel the loss even more keenly. Every day apart is a reminder of what they cannot freely express, a silent ache that they carry privately. This inner battle also explains the subtle behaviors you might notice, the fleeting check-ins, the nostalgic references, the occasional attempts at conversation that stop short of depth. Each is a tentative exploration, a way to feel the connection without fully surrendering to it. They are testing the emotional waters, seeking reassurance that the risk of intimacy is manageable. This phase is not dramatic, but it is intense internally. Their longing and fear coexist in a fragile equilibrium, and you, as the person they crave, are at the center of this invisible tension. You, on the other hand, experience this differently. Empathy and emotional awareness allow you to feel every subtle shift, every gap in communication, every sign of withdrawal. You might notice the absence in ways they cannot, because your emotional system is designed to absorb and reflect connection. You process closeness and distance deeply, and when it disappears, it leaves a vacuum. Your mind searches for answers, your heart experiences the absence as rejection, and your sense of self can even become entangled in their silence. You feel forgotten, erased, abandoned. But what is happening inside them is not absence, it is a delayed, cautious awakening to the value of what they once had. Empaths are wired to care, to nurture, and to give. They naturally create a safe emotional space, but for those who fear intimacy, this space can be terrifying. You were the safety they craved, yet the very closeness you offered triggered the defense mechanisms they had built to survive. When you are gone, that safety is absent. They begin to recognize, too late perhaps, that the person they pushed away is irreplaceable, that the connection they resisted is one they secretly long for. This realization, however, does not always come with action. While you might hope for reconciliation, they are often hesitant. The internal fear that drove them away is still present. They long for the connection, but only in a way that feels emotionally safe to them. This creates the painful dissonance. They miss you profoundly, yet their behaviors often suggest the opposite. You feel forgotten, while they feel tethered to memories and emotions they do not yet have the courage to articulate. It is fascinating how absence sharpens perception. Distance becomes a lens through which they examine the connection with clarity that was impossible during the relationship. While you may have experienced their withdrawal as abandonment, they are now noticing what was special and unique about your presence. They begin to remember the small gestures that brought comfort, the way you understood without needing explanation, the laughter that lit up ordinary moments, and the stability you provided without judgment. This reflection can awaken longing in ways they never anticipated. When the emotional intensity that once overwhelmed them is no longer pressing, they start to feel the connection in its full value. Memories become vivid, and absence itself becomes a teacher, highlighting the emotional richness they previously avoided. It is a silent acknowledgement of your importance, often accompanied by a quiet regret for the distance they created. What makes this stage so complex is that their longing is still mediated by fear. They recognize the value of the connection, yet the same defenses that caused withdrawal may prevent them from expressing it. It is an internal calculus. I miss this, I value this, but is it safe to re-enter? The tension between desire and protection is constant. Every thought about you is balanced against the risk of vulnerability, and every memory carries the weight of both nostalgia and fear. This is why chasing or pressuring someone who has withdrawn can be counterproductive. When you attempt to bridge the gap aggressively, your effort may unintentionally reinforce their fears. Increased messages, demands for attention, or emotional confrontation can feel like a threat to the very autonomy they have spent years defending. Paradoxically, the more you push for closeness, the more they pull back, not because they do not care, but because their instinct to preserve emotional control is activated. The path to reconnection is rarely through pursuit. Space, paradoxically, is what often allows them to recognize the depth of their feelings. The quiet absence you create is what teaches them the value of what they lost. This is a painful lesson for those who feel forgotten, because it feels counterintuitive. You want to reach out, to reclaim the connection, to feel visible again, but your absence is often the catalyst that creates reflection on their side. During this phase, subtlety becomes critical. Avoidants are sensitive to perceived pressure, so small, non-intrusive gestures often speak louder than overt attempts to reconnect. A casual observation, a fleeting message, or even letting life move forward without clinging creates an environment where they can safely explore their feelings. The internal longing continues, quietly simmering, as they weigh whether the connection can exist without threatening their sense of control. This brings us to the power of emotional detachment for you. Stepping back is not about punishing them or manipulating the situation. It is about reclaiming your own emotional equilibrium. When you stop investing energy into forcing recognition or chasing validation, you allow your own heart to heal. Detachment creates clarity. It gives you space to process your feelings and acknowledge the value you bring to any connection. Meanwhile, this detachment has an effect on them as well. The absence of pursuit creates a mirror for reflection. It allows them to feel the true impact of the connection without the pressure that initially triggered withdrawal. Slowly, they may begin to recognize that what they thought they could live without was actually central to their emotional world. Space, which once felt like a threat, becomes a window for awareness. And here lies the hidden dynamic. While you regain strength, independence, and emotional clarity, they experience the very thirst you once felt acutely. They are drawn to what they pushed away, but the process is cautious, careful, and often invisible. They are not yet ready to act, but the internal longing grows. Every memory of you becomes sharper, every recollection more emotionally charged, and every moment apart a reminder of what they cannot fully articulate, but deeply feel. By this stage, subtle signs of longing may begin to appear. They might not say it outright, but their behavior can give you glimpses into the emotional storm brewing beneath the surface. Perhaps they check your social media more than before, linger on updates, or notice details about your life that others would miss. They may reference shared memories in conversation, sometimes casually, sometimes with a wistful undertone that betrays more than their words convey. Even fleeting gestures carry immense emotional weight. These are the breadcrumbs of an internal recognition, the acknowledgement that they miss the connection they once resisted, yet they move carefully, not ready to expose themselves fully, testing whether the emotional terrain is safe enough to approach. This is a delicate dance that plays out silently, leaving you sensing a presence that feels both near and impossibly distant. It is important to understand that this is not a sign that everything is back to how it once was. The longing exists alongside fear, hesitation, and deeply ingrained protective patterns. The pull to reconnect may be powerful, but the push of self-preservation is equally strong. They may hesitate, retreat, or even freeze in place emotionally, creating a confusing push and pull for anyone who observes from the outside. For you, this may feel frustrating, ambiguous, or even hurtful, but these behaviors are the visible evidence of the internal conflict that has been quietly unfolding for months or even years. For some, this period becomes the precursor to eventual reconnection. They may reach out, carefully and tentatively, testing the waters before fully engaging. It is rarely sudden or dramatic. Instead, it is measured, deliberate, and cautious. They approach slowly, assessing whether the emotional intensity can now be managed in a way that feels safe. Their internal thirst drives them to consider what they previously avoided, but only if they believe the emotional environment will not overwhelm them as it once did. This is the paradox of the avoidant mind. Absence awakens recognition, but recognition alone does not guarantee action. Their internal longing may be immense, yet it must be balanced against the lingering fear of vulnerability. The process of returning is gradual, requiring both courage and the perception of emotional safety. They are testing not just the waters of reconnection, but also their ability to manage their own emotions without being consumed by them. Every message, every casual conversation, every minor gesture is a carefully weighed step along this journey. Even when they do eventually return, it is crucial to understand that longing and readiness are not the same. Just because they miss you does not mean they are prepared for a healthy, balanced relationship. They may feel the desire to reconnect, yet still struggle with fear, defensiveness, and old patterns that triggered withdrawal in the first place. This distinction is vital for your own emotional clarity. Recognizing that they are processing their own emotions does not obligate you to resume the same dynamic that caused pain or confusion earlier. Their return may be motivated by longing, but the success of the connection depends on both emotional awareness and mutual readiness to engage in a healthier, more conscious way. Understanding this truth allows you to approach any interaction with clarity and emotional strength. You can acknowledge their thirst, their longing, and the subtle signs of attention while simultaneously holding firm in your own value and boundaries. The presence of their desire does not automatically require action on your part. It is a reflection of the internal processes they are navigating, a recognition of what was lost, and a cautious approach toward what might be regained. The ultimate lesson lies not in waiting for them to realize your worth, but in reclaiming it for yourself. The moment you stop seeking validation from someone who ran from intimacy, you reclaim your emotional power. Your sense of self-worth becomes independent of their recognition, and your heart begins to heal on its own terms. This is the true source of transformation. Not whether they return, but whether you can hold your value without needing them to acknowledge it. When you stop chasing and stop trying to prove your worth, you create an internal space of peace and confidence. This is the environment in which both people can potentially interact differently, more consciously, and more safely. You are no longer defined by their absence or their desire. Instead, you define your own emotional world, and in this space, if they are ready, they may approach with the awareness, caution, and emotional maturity that the connection truly deserves. Even if they never return, your heart has learned the most important lesson. Your worth is never contingent on someone else's recognition. You are complete, you are seen, and the peace you cultivate becomes the strongest magnet for connection, not out of need, but out of alignment with the value you inherently carry. In the end, feeling forgotten is not always the truth of the story. Often, it is only part of the narrative, the part you experience while the other person navigates a silent, complicated journey of longing, fear, and internal thirst. Understanding this hidden dynamic allows you to interpret their absence differently, regain emotional clarity, and step into a space of empowerment where your heart is no longer tethered solely to their actions. You may feel forgotten, but in their mind and their emotions, the story is far from over.